Hey guys, I'm Fidel1258 here. I wanted to do a bit more of a deeper dive on the upcoming change with respect to Splinterlands as we lead into Conclave Arcana in the racial synergies. We talked about it already. I think it's a big deal. Hopefully you watched the video. If you didn't, check that one out. 15 minutes talking about why I think this really is going to dramatically and dynamically impact the game meta. But today I just want to specifically zone in on this one example that they talked about in the town hall, Fithe Bladestorm, and how this monster gives us an example of the impact of these synergies. Let's talk about Fithe. This will be a shorter video. I hope you'll hang out with me. Let's get into it. Okay, so Fithe Bladestorm was the one example that Nate shared the stats with. And he made the point of drawing the distinction that it's not just summoners that will be able to introduce this dwarf on dwarf sort of rally cry. It isn't just summoners that will be able to enable that. Monsters, like Fithe Bladestorm, being a dwarf, will have the capacity through ability to call upon other dwarves, regardless of Splinter. He used those words. I'm gonna quote him here because I want to make sure we get this right. And he said that as a result, when that synergy happens, when Fithe actually brings in another dwarf by that ability, his first ability, which calls the other dwarves, turns into his second ability for all dwarves, which is the void armor. Let's listen to Nate say that because I want to make sure I'm getting it right. But if that's accurate, that's a huge, huge deal. And I want to show a couple examples of synergies that just come off the top of my head for how that would be really impactful for dwarves. Okay, let's hear what he has to say.
For purposes of Conclave, the racial trait dwarf does make a difference, because if you look further down below, you'll notice, that's weird. I get the +1 armor. I've seen that before. But then you see these two abilities that apparently are linked. You see these little two lines, and they look linked in some way, and that would be a keen observation, because the first graphic represents an ability known as, right now, the name that Joey's hoping to go with is Racial Dominion. Racial Dominion basically means that this dwarf is capable, during the team building stage, of calling upon every dwarf in the game. So every dwarf in the game, regardless of element. So even though he's fire, if there's a water dwarf or an earth dwarf or a freaking, death dwarf or whatever element they belong to, they're going to come calling. And so when you click him and then you go to the next stage to choose your units for your team, you're not just going to see fire units. You're going to see all the dwarves. If you're in wild, it's quite a substantial amount of dwarves, right? So you're going to see all the dwarves. And then on top of being able to access all those dwarves, you see the ability that's linked to Racial Dominion. This says Void Armor. That basically means that every dwarf that's come to rally to Mr. Bladestorm, Fithe Bladestorm, they are going to be endowed with Void Armor. So dwarves are known to carry a lot of armor and shields and whatnot. So don't be surprised if this ends up being a pretty critical meta to gameplay. And you can imagine that you have a whole team of dwarves, and this guy is not only calling water dwarves and earth dwarves and death dwarves and life dwarves, but now they all have void armor. That's huge. That's like, Rebellion introduced tactics. This represents racial synergies, and if you're thinking about this, then it's dawning on you, whoa, this is a pretty big deal.
I'll stop him there, and I fully agree with that last sentiment. This is a big deal. I really think this is going to dramatically change how we engage with deck building, card collection, how you invest in the game, because you're going to want to get some cards that you might have otherwise slept on, because it now is going to introduce totally new ways to utilize them, fresh new utility, and possibly even in not just from a play perspective, but maybe from an investment perspective, because certain cards that were crap are now great. Maybe they go from B tier to S tier because of these synergies. If you're the first to recognize those those synergies and the new utilities, then that's where the financial opportunity could flourish as well. But I don't want to focus on any of that right now. I just want to say I agree this is a big deal. Let's go spend a few minutes just looking at Fithe in particular. As I look at Fithe and I see this, I forget what he called that, but this is the ability that calls the other dwarves across every splinter. And this is what happens if there's another dwarf. They all get void armor. They all get void armor. So Fithe Bladestorm, I guess this is one of the summoners. I understand that now. I thought this was a monster for 4 mana, but this must be a summoner. And it has that ability, I would think. Yeah. It is, because it doesn't have any, it doesn't have hearts, it doesn't have armor, it doesn't, it itself, these are just its abilities. So this is a summoner, it draws on other dwarfs, it works within the fire splinter, but it also calls every single dwarf. And just as I meet with that Fithe Bladestorm, as I was thinking about void armor with respect to dwarves, this is not a modern example, but the very first thing that came to mind was a card that I used to hate and now find a lot of function for. Here's what it is. The Grumpy Dwarf. The Grumpy Dwarf is a card that, it's an old beta card. And yes, these summoners will be functional in wild, right? They'll be functional in wild. They'll be utilized there as well. And they will have a deep impact. And maybe in some ways they'll have a deeper impact because they'll have more dwarves with which, or elves or gnomes or to draw upon. But I'm usually and more particularly interested in modern because that's a smaller pool of cards. But still, for today, with void armor, I think about Grumpy Dwarf, and this card was, one of its limitations was always that it had relatively low hit points. 4 hit points at the highest levels is just not enough. And magic has always been a problem, and in relatively, like in the last, 2-3 years of Splinterlands, Blast, maybe even 4 years of Splinterlands, more than half of the life of Splinterlands, Blast has been a problem with cards like Ruler of the Seas. And so Blast, magic I mean specifically, and so this armor does nothing for the reach monster in the second position. That magic Blast monster will delete you and your Grumpy Dwarf gets nothing. No value, no contribution, no meaningful. It just dies. It's been too weak, and it never had void armor, and void armor never existed. But now it does retroactively. And so this card, does this card get new value? I don't know. Does it get new utility? Yes, it does. Does that mean it needs to go up in price moving forward? I don't know. That's going to depend on the demand and the player base growth, etc. And every one of us has to sort of weigh those, analyze those possible synergies. This is one specific synergy you literally can weigh. It's like, how meaningful would this card be to you? Do you play in the wild? Yes or no? If you play in the wild, do you think this card would be meaningful? Are you planning on buying Conclave Arcana? If so, you probably get that summoner we just showed. And if you get that summoner, then you certainly want to have all the dwarves, elves, gnomes, and Ulans. And there's one more I think I'm forgetting. But having all of those is going to unlock lots of these things. That's one example he talked about. But that sort of implication is going to move forward. And here's another cool example. Let's do one more example before we wrap up here. The only other dwarf, when you search dwarf, now there could be others that are not called dwarf, but when I search the word dwarf, the only other I get is exploding dwarf. And again, this card was amazing. I love this card. I've done videos on this card in the past. It's exceptional with you look at a 7 melee damage, trample, retaliation, piercing, blast. The greatest vulnerability and limitation Achilles heel of this card is the 1 hit point. It has 1 hit point at every level. Blast damage, a fast attacker, true strikers, because the speed can allow me to stay alive if you miss me. But there's just too many ways for this thing to die really quickly and then just remove all of that nuclear power. This thing's a beast if it lives or if it hits and kills you. But if it runs into thorns, if it runs into, a blast monster that's fast, a magic monster in particular, nothing saving it, not even armor. It doesn't have void armor, but now it does. It's an exploding dwarf, and it can be used in conjunction with the Fithe Bladestorm to bring and apply, look, +1 armor, and it becomes void armor. That's huge. These are 2 implications from the wild division, from the wild league. I have to believe there'll be significant implications for the modern league. And as I alluded to in my longer video yesterday and this shorter video even earlier today, you have to remember that while those two examples are modern specific, or sorry, wild specific, and I don't have anything to hold up from modern. You have to know that more are coming, more dwarves, more ulans, more elves, and more gnomes, and whatever the other race was. They're coming. They're coming in Conclave. There will be many of each. So that will put this utility at the forefront in modern as well, and it's even more impactful in modern because that card selection is so small, 250 cards maybe versus 750 cards or whatever in wild. And so an impactful card that's maybe a B tier in, just general, like across all Splinterlands card history, will be S tier if in a modern league where there's only 200 selections that you can choose between. You see how the footprint becomes bigger, and that's why I'm really interested. Although these two examples today were wild specific, I'm really deeply interested to try and get in front of this and think this through, both for myself and maybe with you, for how this is going to impact modern. We're going to know so much more once we see the Conclave Arcana cards. Which ones are dwarves? What are their abilities? How well are they going to work together? Because they could have interesting abilities but not work together. There's so many moving pieces to this, but I want to leave it with this. This is a dramatic and radical change to how this game plays and how you increase your effectiveness within the game. It's no longer just about simply identifying overpowered cards and acquiring as many of them as you possibly can and utilizing them as effectively as you can within every context that you can. That's still a huge piece of it, but now there's this other piece where sometimes cards this has always been true. Some kinds of cards that aren't the best can still help you win, but now it's even more true. And that dynamic, or that accentuation to that reality, is going to bring out a lot more player agency, and in my opinion, a lot more fun. I wonder if you agree. Let me know in the comments below. Have an amazing time. Amazing day today, guys. God bless. Bye for now.